Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. Good morning to those of you in the Central and the Pacific time zone. Our friends who are following from Israel, from Europe, I want to wish you a good evening. And on behalf of the Friends of the IDF, we have a very special guest, someone who's really been incredibly gracious of his time, his talents, and his energy to really update us. And that's Arsen Ostrovsky. Arsen is known to many of you. Many of you follow him. He serves as a CEO of the ILF, the International Legal Forum, as well as he's a senior scholar at Miskav. But he's an incredible Jew, incredible person. And that is, he originally comes from Sydney, Australia. He's been in Israel and has an international following. And it's just very gracious of him to take the time that he has for us and to really engage us, to educate us, and share with us what's happening on the international scene. Arsen, if I can hand it over to you, thank you.
Sure. Steve, thank you for that very gracious introduction, and honestly, all the incredible work that FIDF has been doing. Your work was needed and necessary and deeply appreciated before October 7, and I think it's events post that date, I think have only underscored the indispensability of FIDF to Israel, to our defense forces, and I think to the Jewish state as a whole. So certainly from our end, there's a deep sense of appreciation for all your ongoing support. But as we've seen in the events, certainly in the last few weeks as well, with the developments at the International Court of Justice just the other day, and the National Criminal Court just a few days ago as well, how relevant and how central the effect will be specifically on the IDF, on the way we conduct this war, on Israel's image abroad, and certainly on our soldiers on a day-to-day basis. I have to, if I can, just sort of begin sort of from a holistic sort of overview, macro perspective. You know, look, I've practiced law as an attorney in one way, shape, form, another for 20 years. I've studied the law for a few years more. My thesis was on International Criminal Court, and it pains me to say that I'm not entirely sure where we're going into the future, because what we're seeing with the decision of the courts in the last few weeks is, quite honestly, I think, a path to somewhat of a breakdown of the international legal order. There is no other way, I think, to describe what we have seen other than a gross and egregious perversion of justice, but also weaponization of the law against Israel, and specifically against the Israeli Defense Forces. I don't think there's any other way to describe when, for example, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, Karim Khan, elevates a genocidal terrorist group and their leaders, Yahya Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh, and Mohammed Deif, on the same level as the democratic leaders of the State of Israel. This is no different to comparing Hitler, quite frankly, and FDR and Churchill. This is something that is morally repugnant, and it's an abomination that really does a great disservice to the court itself. The ICC was created in 2002, essentially as a court of last resort, in order to end the impunity and to prosecute those who are guilty of the most heinous crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Right next to The Hague, also in The Hague, right next to the ICC, we have the International Court of Justice. The ICC looks at potential crimes and actions committed by individuals, whereas the ICJ, the Court of Justice, looks at either disputes between states or countries, and also has the ability to adjudicate on matters concerning treaties that form within the confines of the United Nations, including the Genocide Convention itself. And you have another absurdity where in The Hague you have South Africa stand up, quite literally, essentially as a legal counsel for Hamas at The Hague, to make the case that Israel is committing genocide. And they're doing this, by the way, also in front of a judge who gave the verdict just the other day from Lebanon, a country that does not even recognize the State of Israel, and the same judge who, when he was the Lebanese ambassador to the United Nations, had already charged Israel with committing war crimes, human rights violations, and apartheid as well. The ICJ is essentially a organ of the United Nations. It is a political body. The judges are elected by the United Nations. There is no other way, I think, to say that, to observe what we have happened other than, I think it's this inability that we're seeing of these courts that have become, quite frankly, instruments or tools of the Palestinian lawfare campaign against Israel to delegitimize Israel, to paint the State of Israel as a pariah, to accuse the IDF of the most heinous crimes. What we're seeing is this inability to distinguish between democratic states and genocidal terrorist groups. Quite frankly, it's not Israel that ought to be on trial here. The IDF has gone above and beyond to levels that are unprecedented in the history of modern warfare to abide by the norms of international humanitarian law and to avoid causing harm to civilians. It is Hamas, as we know, that is not only open in their intentions of wanting to commit genocide. Their charter says they seek to commit genocide, and then they acted on those intentions on October 7th, and furthermore said subsequently thereafter that they would do so again and again until Israel is annihilated. But yet here we are, and we have the State of Israel on trial against this crime of genocide that was developed by actually a Polish Jewish jurist, Raphael Lemkin, in the wake of the Holocaust to describe the attempted systematic annihilation of the Jewish people now being weaponized against us in the wake of the single largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. That essentially is where we are today. And you have two very different but parallel cases happening now. At the ICJ, it is Israel being accused of genocide. Just the other day, a preliminary verdict was given by the court, which said many things, and a lot of it has also, by the way, been misinterpreted because there was a specific reference to Rafah. South Africa went to the court to demand that two things. One, that Israel halt its offensive in Rafah, and two, to put a halt on the war basically altogether, to demand that Israeli forces withdraw from Gaza. The court ruled only with respect to Rafah, and it said that Israel must halt its Rafah offensive. However, and missing in this discussion was the second part. Essentially, it did not order an unconditional halt, nor in its entirety, but basically said Israel must halt it only insofar as it would otherwise violate Israel's obligations under the Genocide Convention. Now, Israel has at all times, since the very first day of the war that was launched by Hamas, not only, as I said before, abided by its obligations, but gone above and beyond to minimize civilian casualties, to provide safe passage, and to conform with its obligations under international law. And its sister court, essentially, at the ICC, the prosecutor had said that both the Hamas leaders and, absurdly, of course, also that Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant were guilty of various war crimes or crimes against humanity. Insofar as the Israeli leaders was concerned, the biggest most surprising charge was that they accused them of intentional starvation of the Palestinian people, which likewise, as we know, is an absurdity in its own right, because we know that over 500,000 tons of food and aid have been provided. I think it's something like 30,000 plus trucks, several hundred trucks per day continue to go in there. Insofar as there are, of course, any any restrictions on aid coming in. We've seen that only in the last couple of weeks, of course, as Hamas terrorists have continued to fire and rain down rockets on Kerem Shalom crossing, which is one of the primary crossings from Israel that provides humanitarian aid. We can get into a lot more detail specifically about the court itself, including how it operates, including principles of complementarity. But I think one point here, especially, that it's necessary to underscore that this is not only a threat to the state of Israel. When international courts and the very international order is politicized, when the rule of law is put behind political considerations, it is a risk not only to the state of Israel, but is a risk to the United States, to American troops, and quite frankly, to every democracy that is fighting terror. Because when you have courts putting as a priority political considerations over the rule of law, making spurious, unfounded charges and allegations, as we've seen against Israeli soldiers, that is a threat to every democracy that is fighting terror, and that includes the United States.
Arsen, the bill, and you've described this as lawfare, this is the weaponization of law. It's an abomination to law. Look, we know the statistics in the history of asymmetric warfare, where the enemy dresses in civilian clothing, works out of UNRWA schools, works out of Red Crescent ambulances, works out of kindergartens, mosques, etc. In urban war, the average has been 9 civilians have died for every 1 combatant. And we know over the course of the Hamas battles, in 2012, it was 2 to 1. That's using Hamas's numbers, which we know are inflated, which we know are false. We know they're lies. But if you work with their numbers, it's 2 to 1. In 2014, it was 1 to 1, the 70 days of Sukkot time. In 2021, it was 0.7 to 1. And in the numbers now, which the United Nations have downgraded the lies that Hamas has said, if you work with the UN numbers, we're probably looking at 0.8 civilians for every 1 combatant. That's off the bell curve. Never, ever before in history has anyone ever come close to these numbers. In other words, we hear this from the American generals, we hear this from the British generals. A number of the British generals and colonels who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan were taken into Gaza City, taken into Khan Yunis, and they came out of there. Besides describing the incredible success and the incredible talent of the IDF,
let me ask you, do you know the numbers for US forces in Iraq and Afghanistan?
The average was 9 to 1, but I understand in urban warfare, I understand though that Fallujah was 23 to 1. And I understand there were certain battles that you even had numbers of 30 to 1. I'm talking about urban battles.
Yeah, in some battles, yeah, you're absolutely right. Overall, it was roughly between 3 to 5 to 1. So even still, as you say here, even if you take the UN's numbers, which halved, you essentially have something like 0.8 to 1, which is extraordinary. But that doesn't even begin to tell you the full story, because we can't look at the numbers in a vacuum. For Israel, every civilian death is a tragedy. For Hamas, every civilian death is a strategy. Therein lies the difference between us. And we know the extent to which the IDF forces have gone in order to minimize casualties. We have given millions of leaflets, telephone calls. No other army in the history of warfare telegraphs in advance, including by weeks, when they're going to attack, who they're going to attack, where they're going to attack, and how they're going to attack. The Israelis have provided safe passage. They've given paths how to evacuate, but we know that Hamas continues to use these people as human shields. So, if the numbers on their own are really extraordinary, but when you look at them in the context of the overall picture of the way that Hamas treats civilians and the extent to which Israel goes to safeguard and protect Palestinian civilians, and does so at risk to our own soldiers, it's really something quite extraordinary that has not been seen in the history of certainly modern warfare.
I had the blessing of going with Brigadier General Benzi Gruber when he's invited to address the graduating cadets at West Point. Each spring, he addresses the graduating cadets in Colorado Springs of the Air Force. And just, to see the Q&A, to see him engage with them, and then the standing ovation they give them, where he's brought in to talk about the whole notion of the Israeli ethics of war, the Israeli ethical code that every commander instills in their soldiers. It's just such an abomination that we're seeing. The first question that we want to ask you is, we've been told that since Israel's not a party to the Rome Convention, the ICC has no jurisdiction over any country that is not a party of that convention or that does not subscribe to the ICC. If that's the case, and I know in the United States of America, Israel, others are not a member, what right do they have to even engage in this if they have no jurisdiction?
In theory, in principle, they have no right. What has happened is that the Palestinians have signed onto the Rome Statute, and the court has ruled that by virtue of the Palestinians signing onto the Rome Statute, that any crime supposedly committed on Palestinian territory, as they have said, is therefore liable to the court's jurisdiction. Now, there are many absurdities in this particular consideration, not least of which is that the Palestinians do not fit any kind of definition of a state. They do not have that granted to them from the United Nations, which only the Security Council can do. They do not meet any legal qualifications for statehood, but nonetheless, the ICC in 2021 had said that the Palestinians are a state in consideration of their ability to sign onto their own statute, and therefore the court has jurisdiction over anything that happens on, I quote, Palestinian territory. Now, that's number one. You have the jurisdictional issue, which ought to have put a full stop on this even getting any further. But then you have also what is called in international law the principle of complementarity. Now, the ICC is essentially, it's a court of last resort, and it's governed by this principle of complementarity, which means that their jurisdiction, assuming there is jurisdiction, can only be asserted in the event that a national court does not have the ability or the willingness to investigate alleged crimes or infringements. Now, we know that Israel is a vibrant democracy with an independent judiciary. Not only has it investigated Israelis, it has pronounced Israelis guilty of certain violations, including former presidents as well. So the Supreme Court in Israel does not shy away from this. At the moment as well, there are some 50+ investigations that are ongoing. Israel's Attorney General is an independent individual. Soldiers on the ground, the commanders, they determine every potential action if it conforms to principles of proportionality, international humanitarian law. Even, by the way, Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, by the way, when he visited Israel not long after the massacre, he actually said that, and I mean, paraphrase, but actually he said that Israel has trained lawyers and the ability to investigate itself. How quickly he forgets his own words. Now, that should have precluded this going anywhere else, because we're talking about Israel. This is not Russia. This is not Turkey. This is not some dictatorship. Israel is an open, vibrant democracy with an independent judicial system that does and continues to investigate independently, and where necessary, prescribe certain, obviously, punishments or infringements that occur. So, based on jurisdictional and complementarity aspects alone, this case really should not have seen the light of day.
Share with us a distinction between the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and its jurisdiction.
So
as opposed to the ICC.
Okay, so the International Court of Justice is essentially it's the judicial organ of the United Nations, and they have the ability to adjudicate over disputes between states, There'll be any number of disputes about territorial borders, disputes about trade, and so on. But it also has the ability to adjudicate over issues concerning treaties or conventions that form part of the United Nations body, including the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention was signed or enacted and signed immediately in the wake of the Holocaust and World War II. And it has its roots, its foundations in the Holocaust itself. Raphael Lemkin, the man who defined the term Holocaust, was in fact one of the drafters. Now, the Genocide Convention is the single most ratified treaty or convention in the world. I don't know the precise number, but almost every single nation on earth is a party to the Genocide Convention. That includes Israel, that includes even countries like Russia, like North Korea, Venezuela, and so on. So you have this absurdity now that if South Africa can say, and the way they've managed to file these proceedings is that the Genocide Convention not only obliges, obviously, every country in the world to not commit acts which could be deemed as genocidal, but also it obliges every country to take action to prevent another state from doing so as well, and to hold them accountable, which is what South Africa absurdly is claiming in bringing Israel before these proceedings. So the absurdity in this is that the threshold now is potentially so low that any country can bring such proceedings against any other country. You could have, in theory, North Korea, Venezuela bring these proceedings against America, against US troops. You saw just a few weeks ago, Nicaragua, not exactly a great bastion of human rights, try and bring Germany into these proceedings and say that Germany, by virtue of providing weapons, arms, and munitions to Israel, is complicit in this genocide.
We saw in the United States Senate, Senator Cotton of Arkansas and others, we're going to have, they're actually pushing to have ramifications for the corruption of law like this. I don't know what kind of teeth that will have. If you want to comment on that, that if the court, continues to act in this abominable way, the question is, can there be ramifications for the court for violating its own morality?
Look, there certainly can be. I mean, look, the United States is, on the one hand, somewhat limited in what they can do because the US also is not a treaty. And by the way, both the United States and Israel are not parties to the Rome Statute precisely because 20 odd years ago, they understood the dangers of a court such as this when it becomes politicized and the threat it can create to democracies and sovereign nations like the US and Israel. However, the US, in this particular case, I think also understands the threat it has to US troops abroad. If rogue countries or prosecutors who become politicized take actions against the US troops as well. So I think actions like what Cotton is doing, like others do, in fact, have teeth. We saw that, for example, under the previous prosecutor, Bensouda, who is Karim Khan's predecessor, sanctions were applied to her by the Trump administration when they sought to pursue US over American troop actions in Afghanistan, for example. So there are a number of actions that can be taken, including sanctions against the prosecutor, against senior court officials in terms of preventing their ability to travel to the United States, which obviously would cause enormous hardship in their ability to carry out their duties. It can also include potential sanctioning of ICC bank assets as well. And of course, the US can pressure other allies and democracies, especially in Europe, which are the primary funders of the court, the UK, Japan, for example, by the way, as well, Germany and others, to withhold their funds.
Where do you see this going?
That's a good question.
It's an unfair question, but I mean, it's just, it's so outrageous that here we are, you mentioned Raphael Lemkin. Here he's a survivor from Lemberg, which today is referred to as Lviv. Most of his family was obliterated, was annihilated, and here he is, he created the term, he created this area of law to ultimately to prevent this from happening, to protect innocent civilians. And instead of this being focused on Iran, instead of this being focused on some of the most evil actors in history, here they've taken this term, they've manipulated it, they've turned it on the most ethical army on earth, the most ethical country on earth. And it's just, I mean, anyone who has any sense of morality and ethics, your blood boils when when you hear this, when you see this corruption, as you said, this abomination of law, of international law. Where does this go? I mean, it's an unfair question, but we're just so frustrated, seeing this, watching this.
Look, I think it's an entirely fair question, by the way. Anyone that does believe in the rule of law, anyone that does believe in the international rules-based system, as we all do, ought to be outraged. The ICC, for example, was created as a court of last resort in order to end impunity for the world's worst persecutors of war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. Was never envisaged for these sort of Orwellian circumstances where Israeli leaders of a democratic state would be charged with these crimes for the mere act of defending its citizens from the worst massacre committed since the Holocaust. And when we still have hostages in Gaza that are being held captive, and when they talk about, for example, Rafah, let's not forget that only today, 12+ rockets were fired from Rafah into Israel, including myself, to go to shelter as well. So what we are seeing is an absolute abomination, and to place leaders of a genocidal terrorist group and the leaders of a democratic state of Israel, even on the same path, on the same par, is, quite frankly, it is an abomination. It is it's a subversion and a perversion of law and a weaponization of the very system that we are relying on, that has been enacted in the wake of the Holocaust. So when you're asking me where we go from here, I don't have an answer for you, because I think what someone like Karim Khan has done is he has shred whatever had been left of the court's credibility and turned it into a politicized process at the expense of the rule of law and those victims who truly need the court's protection. When you're looking at what Iran is doing, when you're looking at what some of the world's worst regimes are doing, he didn't issue an indictment against Khamenei. He didn't issue an indictment against Bashar al-Assad of Syria, or the Chinese over what's happening with the Uyghur community, but chose to request or to seek an indictment against leaders of the state of Israel. So, this doesn't bode well for the future, and perhaps there's time to rethink the court's operation if it's going to prioritize political considerations above legal precedent.
If you could go back to the Trump administration, they actually imposed sanctions. They responded and they acted.
Yeah.
What do you see being proper measures for this corruption of law?
I think the sanctions that were employed against Karim Khan's predecessor, Bensouda, were very smart and effective, and put a halt on the ICC's investigation. I think those sanctions need to be reimposed immediately, not only on Karim Khan, the prosecutor, but also on the senior staff of the court themselves. They cannot operate fully without the ability to travel freely to the United States, to meet with their counterparts, with officials, with various lawmakers and other official people. So I think those sanctions need to be introduced and ramped up. There's possibility of possibly sanctioning assets of the court as well to hamper their financial operation. And I think, as I said before, the US needs to also look at your allies in Europe, which are the primary funders of the court, But I'll add one more thing. The Palestinian Authority needs to be made aware that they cannot continue this process of lawfare, of going to every international court, of hijacking every multilateral organization and pursuing this strategy of lawfare, turning every court, every international body into a politicized tool in order to attack and vilify and delegitimize Israel and the IDF, and to continue doing so without ramifications, without consequences. So I think they need to understand that that comes with a price as well.
It's a challenge.
At the end of the day, and and I can tell you this, and I'm sure you understand, only a few days ago, and I know you saw the video of the 5 girls being taken, kidnapped, abducted into Gaza. We looked in their eyes, we saw them bruised, bloodied, beaten, terrified. We saw one of the Hamas terrorists say that, they could impregnate them. No court in the world, no body, no organ, no authority in the world will ever tell Israel to stop until such time as we defeat Hamas and we rescue our girls and all our hostages.
Thank you. Thank you really for sharing with us, for educating us about a sober reality. And you have a situation in the world where when supposedly countries that stand for ethics and morals, support the Muslim Brotherhood, they support, the Shia Caliphate, they support these evil regimes. And that's what enables these regimes to be successful. When they're supported on university campuses, they're supported by media, and they're supported by supposedly what are meant to be a fair court system, which is now just, it's a sad world that we live in. It's a world that in our worst nightmares we never thought would happen.
You're right, and we need to speak up, and I know FIDF is speaking up, and we certainly need your voice and your help, your support, and it's certainly very deeply appreciated, Steve, for all you do in FIDF.
I will say this, Arsen, when you see that poll after poll, most Americans, when the facts are laid out in front of them, they find this incredibly abhorrent. And most Americans have a decent moral compass. Now, again, that's not necessarily that moral ethical compass is not something you see on university campuses. You don't see it in the media. But we're talking about people who were raised with a sense of morality. And when it's laid out for them, they just find this incredibly abhorrent. And to a great degree, many of these people have an incredible affinity to Israel because they see that Israel's the one ethical, moral beacon, the one source of light that stands up to this evil. And they see a world that is appeasing, capitulating this evil, a world that actually partners with this evil. And in that sense, they become endeared to Israel because they feel that Israel is that beacon of morality and ethics that ultimately will stand up. And, with God's help, ultimately will stop and prevent this evil from spreading.
Absolutely right. I think many people, when they listen to the facts, understand that, we're in the front lines of the war for, the values that we both cherish: freedom, democracy, human rights, the rule of law.
We're grateful to you, first of all, for your time, but more importantly, we're grateful to you for fighting this fight and for communicating to the world and exposing these bodies for what they are. We really want to thank you, Arsen.
My pleasure. Anytime. Thank you.